This is one of those Sundays where I feel like I should remind you all that I don't select the passages that we read on Sunday mornings. Those are pre-assigned. These last couple of weeks, the Spirit of Jesus has been telling the church stories that help us to cope with the reality of the world in which we are called to bear witness. Last week, we heard the story of the sower casting seed, and the seed falling on different kinds of soil, some of which was rocky, and some of which was choked by weeds, and some of which was good soil. And the Lord was trying to help his followers understand the reality that when we share the gospel with the world around us, it doesn't take with everybody in the way we would hope. And it certainly doesn't take with everybody in the way we would hope in the time that we imagine it should take. And that helped us to understand that we are not called to somehow change our proclamation to make it more appealing to the world. That helped us to understand that God is about the business of cultivating the soil of the human soul, and that takes different time for everyone. And that helped us to understand that our job is to just keep at it, so that one day when it comes time for the season of fruitfulness, then we find ourselves ready to come alongside those who are experiencing that fruitfulness, maybe finally. Now today we have another story that the Lord is telling the church in order to help us cope with the reality of proclaiming the word in the mission field of this world. We go out into the world, we go out full of verve, empowered by our baptismal identity to share and be Christ for those in need. And what we see so often is so discouraging. I think I had a fun conversation with one of the leaders of our church who shared in a moment of tender vulnerability that he has been moved from a place of from frustration to anger to crushing disappointment at the state of the world and our human family. And that is so often, sadly, the reality. You watch the news and you think to yourself, how could we possibly be so messed up? And then there's this terrible little voice that whispers, could it get worse? And what makes matters worse is when you do go out into the field of this world, it doesn't seem like karma works the way you wish it would. You see the liars and the cheats, those who exploit, those who manipulate, and far from paying some sort of exorbitant price for their practice of immorality. Oh no. These sons of guns seem to be getting ahead, far ahead. They don't seem to be cursed with a thunderbolt from heaven that strikes them with some terrible illness. Their bank accounts don't seem to be diminished in any way. They don't seem to be suffering any price for the horrible way that they are doing human life. You think to yourself, Lord, how is that fair? It sure doesn't feel fair. That has been an experience for the people of God, not just in the ancient church, but far behind the ancient church. People of faith have been wondering, Lord, when does judgment kick in? When does your divine power start to set things right? Because we're sort of getting sick of seeing the bad guys winning left and right. And into that reality, Jesus speaks this morning's parable. And this morning's parable is a warning. First of all, it's a warning that it can be really, really challenging for those of us who are just lowly little human beings to authoritatively and reliably determine who is a weed and who is wheat, who is a goat and who is a sheep. You might think you've got a pretty good hunch about which category someone in your life or someone in the headlines falls into. But our history as people of faith is replete with stories of people we thought were weeds, we thought were goats, and turned out to be fruitful followers of God, lambs of his own flock. So one of the warnings in this morning's story that Jesus tells us is to beware the temptation of trying to classify people. If you look back at church history, there is a strand of Protestantism that came up right alongside Lutheranism, and it's called Calvinism. And there was a strand of Calvinism that was particularly popular here in the United States before there was a United States. And if you look at that part of our history, that part of Christian history that thought that they were empowered by their baptism to correctly identify who is sheep and who is goat, who is wheat and who is weed, there are all sorts of horror stories about how very wrong Christians got it. In fact, they were so wrong that in retrospect, we look back on them and wonder to ourselves, I wonder if those guys were weeds. What's more, as members of this part of the family of the body of Christ, we remember what we just said around the baptismal font. I confess that I am captive to sin and I cannot free myself. I have sinned against you, Lord, in my thoughts, in my words, and in my deeds, by what I have done and by what I have left undone. We speak that truth many Sunday mornings to remind ourselves there's a little bit of weediness in us too. Yes, even among the elect. And if we take time to acknowledge that truth, it doesn't necessarily remove all the weeds from the garden of our soul all at once, but it keeps us from slipping into the trap of judgmentalism that this passage is trying to warn us against. So, you might not be good at identifying who's a weed. And one of the reasons you might not be good at it is because you've got some weediness inside the garden of your own soul. So, in other words, judge not lest ye be judged. But also, Jesus reminds us of something that we usually don't think about. When you judge someone as being in the wrong, when you judge someone, not just because they did something wrong, but because you think they're a bad person, you judge them to be a weed. When you do that, there will be collateral damage. Someone other than the person you think is a weed will pay the price for your judgment. That sounds strange. Most of the time, we think about the consequences of sin as being contagious, right? And this is when sin is so frustrating and so sad. When someone is committing a sin and they don't pay the price for it, instead the people around them who are innocent pay the price for that one sin. And it is heartbreaking, especially when that person is one of the last, the lost, the least, the little, or the lonely of our human family. We're used to thinking of sin as being contagious in its consequences in that way. But Jesus is reminding those of us who would like to take up our place on God's seat of judgment that also when we exercise judgment, when we choose a spirit of vengeance in our minds, with our mouths, and in our actions, when we do that, it won't just be the weed that gets yanked. Our judgment will inadvertently rip out some wheat too. One of the saddest instances I have seen this dynamic in my almost 20 years of ministry is when a married couple is coming to church, or a family is coming to church, or a friend circle is coming to church, and something about church makes someone in that couple or that family or that friend circle unhappy. So, because we've got all that weediness in our hearts, it could be, I don't like the music. I didn't like that music. Like, seriously? Christendom is collapsing? Western civilization is imploding? And you're going to opt out of the first best hope of redemption because you don't like the music? Or a pastor preaches a sermon and says something that I found offensive. Well, join the club. Or you can all think of all the stuff they come up with. And they use their authority as a member of that relationship, or as a member of that family, or as a member of that friendship circle, and they're gonna decide, I'm gonna yank this weed from my life and cast it aside. And usually when they do that, what they're doing is they are pulling their loved ones, whether it's a spouse or a friend or a family, they're pulling a loved one away from the family of the church. And when years go by and someone finally says, well, I got mad and I left, but I didn't go anywhere else, and now I'm about to die, kind of feel like I should call the minister to give me one last blessing before I shove off into the afterlife. And I'm the one then, or someone like me is the one, that comes alongside, usually not the person on their deathbed, it's usually the spouse. And the spouse is isolated. They have missed out on so much. They're sad for having their relationships ripped away from them. And yet, out of a place of loyalty, they have stood by their spouse. If you don't hear, judge not lest ye be judged. Beware of wielding judgment, because you can't tell who's a weed, who's wheat. And if you can't hear, you've got some weediness in your own soul's garden, so be careful about judging people by a standard that you yourself are not observing. If you can't hear that, then hear this. When you judge people, it's not just those people who suffer the consequences of that judgment. The people around them, the people that might be somehow moved through them, also suffer those consequences. So if God, in this story that Jesus tells us, is planning on withholding ultimate judgment until the end, for fear that the angels might get something wrong, then for goodness sakes, we sinners should realize that we are not capable of wielding the tool of judgment without making some terrible mistakes. So instead of trying to be the harvester this week, what if you just were finally content to be wheat? Wheat doesn't do the weeding. Wheat bears fruit. And that's all you got to work on. What is your fruit? What is the fruit of the Spirit? The love, the joy, the peace, the patience, the kindness, the faithfulness, the generosity, the gentleness, and self-control. That's the fruit that you ought to be bearing instead of worrying about the weeds that seem to be getting ahead, that are growing up right beside you. You aren't the gardener in this story. You aren't the harvest team. You are wheat. So just allow the seed that God is going to plant in your heart at this table this morning, just let it bear fruit in your life instead of being so dang judgy.